Today we're going to speak about animal byproducts. Now, at other times we spoke about things that are the status of things that come right from the animal itself, like the meat or the fat, or other things that come from animal, like glycerin or gelatin or fatty acids, all kinds of different things that are just, so to speak, part of the animal itself that become something that we eat. But today we're going to talk about not things that are the animal itself, but something the animal produces, like the eggs or milk or honey or things like that. So the first thing to talk about is, like this, the Gemara says that if a kosher animal produces something, then it's kosher. And for that reason, we're allowed to drink the milk from a cow. If the same kind of a thing would be made by a non-kosher animal, like milk from a horse, that would not be kosher. And the rule, that's called a Yotzeh, something that came out of something else. And the Gemara gives the rule that Yotzeh min tamei, if something comes from a non-kosher animal, it's not kosher. And if it comes from a kosher animal, then Yotzeh min tahor is tahor. If it comes from a kosher animal, then it's kosher. Now, one big exception to this rule that Yotzeh from a treif animal is not kosher, an exception to that is if what the animal produces is considered Pirshah, which literally means excrement, then it's permitted. So the most obvious things that are included in Pirshah are things that are completely inedible. And Rav Moshe makes the point that when we want to decide if something was edible or not edible, in this situation, we should only care about the time when it came out of the animal. At that point, when it left the animal, was it edible at that point? If it was not, then it's considered Pirshah. The fact is that even though tomorrow we could process it and turn it into something edible, that makes no difference. And the logic is, the only reason why this thing is usher, it's not the animal itself. It's only would be potentially usher because it's Yotzeh, it came out of a non-kosher animal. Well, it stands to reason then, if when it came out of the animal it wasn't usher, the fact later on when it turns into something that's edible, well, it's not being Yotzeh, it's not coming out of the animal at that point, so therefore it's it's not going to be usher. So whereas for a regular, non-kosher food, even if it from a piece of a non-kosher animal, even if it's not edible right now, but if it's edible later on, that would be enough to make it usher. For a Yotzeh, that would not be true. And Rav Moshe's example of that is shellac, otherwise known as confectioner's glaze, which is an excretion from an insect. Now, insects are not kosher, so Yotzeh from an insect should not be kosher. But since the shellac is not edible when it leaves the insect's body, it's considered Pirshah, and it's mutter, even though later on you could make it into a coating that goes onto candies and chocolates and some other things like that. That's Rav Moshe's reasons for permitting it. Now, there are most American Hashgachahs accept this idea. There are those, especially in Eretz Yisrael, who don't and who would not use shellac in kosher food. But again, most in America follow what Rav Moshe says, that this is considered Pirshah when it leaves the animal, and therefore, even though later on you make it into a food item, it stays mutter. Now, this shellac is different than carmine, which is usher, and that's because whereas shellac is the Yotzeh from the bug, carmine is it's a coloring agent, and it's made by crushing up the bugs themselves. So even if we were to say that it's not edible at the time you crush it, but if it later turns into an edible food ingredient, like it does, then it becomes usher. So the difference between the two of them, between the shellac and the carmine, is pretty clear. Shellac is only forbidden as a Yotzeh. When it was Yotzeh, it was not edible. It's just hard, just a hard substance that is not edible. So that's considered Pirshah. It's not usher as Yotzeh. As opposed to the carmine, it might not be edible at the time when it's first created, but since it's the actual Isser itself, it's the bug itself, not a Yotzeh from the bug. Therefore, even if we later, even if it's originally not edible, if it later becomes edible, then it's usher. And now let's move to a whole group of items made by bees. So the first and most obvious thing to say about bees is that bees are not kosher themselves. They're bugs. They're not permitted. But the Gemara says that the honey that comes from a bee is mutter. The Gemara gives two reasons. The Gemara gives two reasons for why. Sorry about that noise. The Gemara gives two reasons for why that's true. The Gemara gives two reasons. The first is that maybe it's not considered to be a product of the bee at all, and maybe it's just basically the nectar that the bee picks up, and it picks up for the different plants, and it just changed minimally, so little that it's considered essentially to be the same thing as the nectar that it came from, and therefore it stays mutter. And the other answer of the Gemara is that in fact it is a Yotzeh, but this is a special exception, and the Gemara brings proofs that the Torah gives a special exception to permit this Yotzeh from a non-kosher animal, even though other Yotzeh are not permitted. Okay, now, what appears to be a very obvious, a practical difference between these two reasons of the Gemara is something called honeydew honey, or otherwise known as forest honey, and that's made by bees who, instead of feeding on nectar from plants, they eat a secretion from a kind of insect called an aphid, and then they use that to make their honey. So the secretion itself is sweet and edible, and it would be usher as a yotzeh from the aphid, from the insect that it came from. So the Gemara's first reason to say that honey is mutter is because it's not. We don't treat the honey as being yotzeh from the bee. It's as if treated just as the nectar itself. Nectar is permitted just from a plant. Nectar is permitted, so the honey stays permitted also. Well, if that's the reason why honey is mutter, then this would not be mutter, because this if we treat it like the thing itself, which is the yotzeh from the aphid, then it's going to be usher. In which case the honeydew honey would also be usher. According to the second reason in the Gemara, that there's a special heter that any honey is permitted, then this would be, even if it's yotzeh, then this would be mutter also. Now there are some people who have come up with reasons why this logic that I just said is not correct. Most Hashgachas or machmir would not treat this as kosher because of this reason, that we treat it as the secretion of the aphid and not as permitted honey. Now, we've been talking now about all kinds of reasons why honey would be inherently kosher, but I do have to mention a couple of things for a person who wants to buy honey in the store. So the first is that if honey's flavored, if not plain honey, then it needs hashgachah because of the flavoring. So when I say that, I just want to mention that lots of times you'll see honey that I'll say on it things, it'll tell you, there's a description on the honey describing where the bees that made this honey collected their nectar from. And the common one is orange blossom. It doesn't mean that this is flavored to taste like orange or something like that, but rather it means they collected from their nectar from these kind of orange trees, the orange blossoms, and that's not a flavored honey. But if it's actually flavored, then it needs hashgachah because of the flavoring that's in there. Now, most honey that we buy is most honey we buy is filtered. It takes out the parts of the bees that get stuck in the honey, literally pieces of the bee's body that fall off into the honey. So there are some situations, not so common, there are some raw honeys which are not filtered at all, in which case if you see spots or different particles floating around in there that don't look like they belong there, they don't look like pieces of honey, like bits of liquid of honey, they should be taken out because they might be the non-kosher parts of a bee. Lastly is, it's possible, it's not required, but it's possible that the honey will be heated to make it more viscous and make it easier to flow into the bottle. And that raises a little bit of a concern that maybe that heating and bottling equipment was used for something that was non-kosher also. Some people consider that to be not very likely, and therefore they say any honey is okay. Other people are more concerned about it, and therefore say that consumers should only buy honey with a retail packages of honey with a hashgachah because of this concern that maybe it was bottled hot on equipment that was used for non-kosher. Now, I've talked the past couple of minutes about honey. There's some other bee products, and one of them is called royal jelly. It's a creamy, bitter-tasting bee secretion from a bee, and it's consumed by the future queen bee, and that's why it's called royal honey. I think it's also eaten by the larvae. All the rest of the bees just eat honey. So some people are of the opinion that this is considered another example of honey, which the Gemara says is mutter, but most assume that it's not. It's not. It doesn't meet one or maybe even both of the Gemara's reasons for why honey should be mutter, and therefore most consider royal jelly to not be kosher. Now, there's another thing that bees make is called pollen. You find it in the pollen basket of the bee on the bee's legs. It's not processed at all. It's just it's the pollen taken off the plants. So it's not yotzeh from the bee at all. The bee just goes around, just collects it on its body, and that's mutter. Now bees then take pollen and they mix it with nectar to make something called bee bread or ambrosia, and it's made of two different things that are both mutter, pollen and nectar, and therefore it is also okay. Also, there's the last thing is something called beeswax. It's something that the bees secrete, and so it's not honey, and it's secreted by the bees. But as we've mentioned before, and this is something that's not edible, and therefore it's considered to be Pirshah. Oh, I'm sorry, I had one more thing to say besides the beeswax. Sorry about that. Bees take plant resins. Resins is something else excreted by different plants they collect it on their legs, they mix it with beeswax, and maybe a drop of saliva, and they use it as something to seal up the hive. It's like a glue to seal up the hive. It's called bee propolis. So the ingredients here we said are things that they make it out of beeswax, which is mutter, and resins, which are mutter also, and a drop of saliva. It's considered to be kosher because the saliva is mamash a tiny amount, and it's in other things also like honey, and it's assumed to be batal, and therefore it's considered to be kosher. Okay, now let's move on to eggs. Eggs from a kosher bird are mutter. There are very few bird breeds that we have a Masorah for that they're kosher, so we're limited to eating the eggs from those birds. So the Masorahs that we have include the common birds that are used to lay eggs in the United States, but there are some other birds that are a little more unusual, not your everyday regular your egg laying chickens. Like for a common question that people ask about is there are these birds from South America. I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this correctly. Aracanal. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but whatever it is, they make eggs that are green or blue. We don't have a Masorah that those chickens are kosher, and therefore we would not permit those eggs. There are also some duck breeds that we don't have a Masorah for. Some we do and some we don't, and therefore we wouldn't buy duck eggs unless we knew they were from a breed that's the kind that we have a Masorah for. Now, there's also last about eggs is that there are a lot of small birds that people refer to as a quail. Basically, it's become like the name for just a small bird, and only some of those things that people call quail do we actually have a Masorah for that they're being kosher, and most people can't tell by looking at an egg which bird it came from. So therefore they would have to buy quail eggs. If you wanted to buy quail eggs, you'd have to buy them from with a Hashgachah on them. This way you'll know that they're coming from one of those kosher breeds. Okay, now our last topic is here, but of the last type of animal byproducts like this. The din is pretty clear. It's very clear that lactose, which comes from cow's milk, is permitted. Lactose is when you make cheese, the curd and whey separate. When you take the whey and you can separate it further and get something called lactose out of it, and it's mutter. But there's a machlokes as to why lactose is mutter. The Shach says, easy why it's mutter. It's yotzeh from a cow. Of course, if the lactose came from cow's milk, it's yotzeh from a kosher animal called yotzeh from a tar. So it came from cows or kosher. It came from cows, and therefore lactose is mutter, just like milk and everything else is. And the Rosh says no. The only reason why lactose is mutter is because it's included in the heter to drink milk from a kosher animal. So it's lactose is just a part of the milk, and therefore it's mutter also. He says, but if there's any other byproducts that a kosher animal will make, that's not permitted. You're not allowed to eat that. And his reason is because he says cows are not kosher. That is to say, cows are a kosher species, but the cow that's producing the milk or something else, you can't eat it now. You have to do shechita to it. You can't eat it as is. It's not edible. It's not kosher right now. It's kosher species, but it's not kosher to eat, so to speak, right now. And therefore, it's considered to be yotzeh from a non-kosher animal. Now, it's true that there's a special leniency for milk and eggs that come from cows, from kosher animals, but that doesn't apply to everything. Any other things that kosher animals make are not acceptable because essentially the cow is not kosher. So the Shach and the Rosh are having machlokes here whether the Isser of yotzeh applies to excretions from a kosher animal. Should we treat it as coming from a kosher animal, therefore it's kosher, or should we say no? Right now the animal is not, so to speak, kosher because you have to shechita to it, therefore you're not allowed to eat it. And the Practicum have talk about which way do we hold like this? Do we follow what this Rosh says or what the Shach says? So there are two things that at first glance seem to be dependent on this machlokes, and these are colostrum and lanolin. Colostrum is a liquid that's produced by the mammary glands of female animals, or humans for that matter, just before and after they give birth. It's very different. It's considerably different from regular milk. The milk that the animal's going to produce, or the person's going to produce, once the baby's, after a few days after it gives birth, this is yellower rather than whiter. It has more protein. It has less fat. So it's some different properties to it, and people believe that it has certain medicinal values to it. So according to the Shach, colostrum from a cow is mutter because it comes from a kosher animal. Cows are kosher. Colostrum is a yotzeh from the cow, so it's mutter also. So it seem at first glance you would think that the Rosh would hold that it's usher, because it's Yotzeh from a kosher animal and it's not milk. That's what you would think at first glance, and the Rosh would see you would think would not be mutter. However, there are proofs that in fact colostrum is permitted. Okay, so now we have to sort of work with this backwards and say, okay, well, if colostrum is mutter, why would the Rosh think that it's mutter? So we have to assume that the Rosh will hold that just like lactose is considered a part of the milk and it's mutter included in the heter of milk, so to colostrum is within the broader group called milk, because essentially it comes from the same place. It has certain similarities to it. So assuming it's considered to be, he would consider it to be milk also. And that would be the reason for the mutter. Again, we have rayas that it's mutter. So we have to say that according to the Rosh, this will be the explanation for why it's mutter. Now, just as an aside about colostrum, is that it's very questionable whether the heter of chalav stam applies to colostrum. There isn't the same kind of oversight and government control, etc., on colostrum as there is for milk. And therefore, it may well be, even if it's permitted, if it's technically permitted, it might be forbidden as chalav akum, unless it has made by chalav Yisrael. Okay. Now, the other thing that might depend on the Rosh and the Shach is lanolin. Lanolin is a wax that's found on sheep's wool before you process it. It has all kinds of uses, and the most prominent use that we think of, that people, at least for eating wise, is it's a precursor for making vitamin D3. Okay, so the simple thing you'd say is the Shach would say it's mutter because it's Yotzeh from a kosher animal, Yotzeh from a sheep. Sheep are kosher, so it's Yotzeh from a sheep. And according to the Rosh, you would say no, because it's Yotzeh from a living sheep. Sheep that's alive is not permitted until you do shechita to it. So you would think that according to the Rosh, it would not be mutter. So some have said that there are possible reasons that even the Rosh would agree that it's mutter. And that's because one of the possibilities is because it's not edible when it's washed off. And therefore it's considered to be Pirshah, like we said beforehand, for Moshe about Shellac. And most American Hashgachas do rely on this. Or some of the other reasons to say that the vitamin D is mutter if it's made from lanolin. But as I mentioned with the Shellac, here it's not exactly the same points, but this, as we mentioned, Shellac, some Hashgachas and individuals do not accept this kula and will not use vitamin D3, which is made from lanolin, which comes from sheep's wool.